I want to thank Stan and Tennille for inviting us today. It's interesting, I've worked on disaster formula allocation since the Midwest floods of the 90s, and I've actually never been to a training. So I hope I'll learn a lot. But in any case, I'm Todd Richardson. I'm the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development in HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. My office's primary job is to connect the research and data analysis that we do with the programs and our policies, in this case for disaster recovery. I'm going to try to give a presentation that doesn't duplicate too much of what Stan and Tennille had to say. So I guess instead of duplication of benefits, I'm going to try to avoid duplication of presentations. My wife tells me I shouldn't tell jokes, but as you all know, we have $16 billion allocated under Public Law 113-2, and so I'm going to go through a conversation about what that law required us to do in terms of figuring out how to target the funds, talk about how we do the allocations, and probably most important for most of you in the room, talk about the data and how you can use these types of administrative data for your own planning efforts. So there are the few key sort of words in the appropriation that we have to sort of pay close attention to as we think about how we allocate these funds. In this case, the most important thing, who's eligible for these funds? And these funds are eligible for all of the disasters of all federally declared major disasters of 2011, 2012, and 2013. So there were, in 2011 and 2012, including Sandy, there were 145 major declared disasters in 2011 and 2012 in 45 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. Now, not all of those disasters will receive CDBG funding, which I'll get to in the next piece here. First off, the $16 billion may not be $16 billion. The sequester does apply to these funds, and unless there's something done to change that, there will be a reduction. I think I've heard that it would be a little, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5%. The other factors come into play here are that the eligible grantees are states or units of general local government. We had to allocate 33% of the funds within 60 days. And as you know, we did allocate $5.4 billion, which was a little over 33% within that time frame. And to use the best available data. Best available data here is key because data is always changing on these disasters, always changing. So we have to use what we have at the time we're making the allocation. And for actually targeting the funds, we look at what are these funds supposed to be used for. They're supposed to be used for restoration of infrastructure and housing and economic revitalization in the most impacted and distressed areas resulting from a major disaster. So how do we do this? So we look at the key words here. Housing. We need to figure out what are unmet needs in housing, what are unmet needs in infrastructure, what are unmet needs for economic revitalization. The data that's available after a disaster, it's not survey data. What we have that we can work with is administrative data. And for allocating funds, there may be better data that a local grantee might have about their particular disaster, but for dividing the pie up, the most critical thing for us is to have data that we have consistently collected across all of the eligible disasters. And so for that, we rely predominantly on the FEMA individual assistance data, the FEMA public assistance data, and the Small Business Administration data from the disaster loan programs. They have both the business disaster loans and loans for homeowners and other residential properties. So to that end, we, on the individual assistance side, FEMA will, as most of you know, or all of you know, folks register for assistance. For owners, there's an inspection done on the real property, and we can use verified loss data from that. For renters, there's inspections done on the personal property loss. And in addition, for disasters, in the case of Sandy in particular, if it's almost all a flooding disaster, there's flood levels for both rental and owner units, which are very helpful in understanding level of damage. On the public assistance side, we wait for FEMA to try to come up with some damage estimates on public assistance needs, and we look at categories C through G, which are the permanent repairs. And on the Small Business Administration side, on the business side, small businesses will apply for disaster loans. That's helpful for us to know who does not get those loans, and SBA does inspections on those properties. Similarly, for the on the homeowner side, the SBA inspections are extremely useful in two ways. One is for us to know who's able to get an SBA loan, but more important is to understand how much it really costs to repair a house to recover. The FEMA verified loss numbers generally understate what it'll cost to repair a house, whereas the SBA numbers are intended to capture, and FEMA's doing that for a reason. They're just trying to find out, are you eligible for our program that tops out at $31,000? The SBA program, they want to give you a loan so that they know you'll fully repair your house. So their estimates are more reflective of what it'll cost to repair. And we do a crosswalk on the same properties that get a FEMA loan with an SBA loan to get an approximate amount of what a multiplier looks like for how much the actual cost is to repair a house in the homeowner side. So obviously the major disaster declaration is a factor here, but when we have to sort of figure out what are these funds intended for, CDBG disaster recovery funds are not appropriated every year. They're not for every disaster. Sometimes they're very narrowly defined. In this case, they're narrowly defined as most impacted. And in the most impacted, we limit the number of eligible disasters we have to disasters that only have an IA designation, have counties that are designated with individual assistance. We limit it also, furthermore, to just the homes that have the most severe damage. So there's a lot of homes that get a lot of damage. Also, most businesses that with the most severe damage when we calculate the unmet needs. And finally, we also define, in order to be able to target these funds very concentrated where the damage is most severe, we define most impacted counties, which many of you may have some questions about when we talk about later. And then we also then do an allocations looking at what the total is for the state and then what some local jurisdictions might have in terms of determining whether they have enough need to warrant an individual grant to the local jurisdiction. There will be multiple allocations of this $16 billion. We've allocated the $5.4 billion, the 34%. We will have another allocation shortly for the 2011 and 2012 disasters that were not Sandy. How many, raise your hand if you're from a 2011 grantee from last year. So those we had $400 million last year for a lot of disasters. There will be an additional amount of money that those disasters are eligible for, plus other disasters in 2012. After we've had a little bit of time for things to settle down in terms of the data and get a better handle on the infrastructure, we'll make another allocation for Sandy. Of course, we'll have to keep in mind that these funds are also available for 2013 disasters. 2013 is still in place, so we'll have to make sure there's still some funding available for other 2013 disasters. So after we make the allocation, the next question comes to the grantees who've got this. Suddenly they find themselves with $1.8 billion, and they know they're going to have to run their own programs and target their funds. How do they target their funds? So the individual assistance data can be a very powerful piece of data for you as well. And I know a number of states have acquired these data from FEMA. We put up a mapping program on our website, www.huduser.org, and there's a little link to it at the bottom here, where we've geocoded all of the IA data for the damaged units, and we've looked at flood depths. And so we have some data available so that you can go look at the block group level and see what the damage is associated with Sandy, just on the flooding levels. So it's a helpful way to get a picture of where the damage is most severe. So that's one way to look at these data. Another way to look at these data, some of you will have seen some analysis that Ben did for the, as part of the work that we've been doing to support response and recovery, where we did some analysis at sort of community level. And we did analysis that looked at concentrated damage. Now, when we think about recovery and our experience with recovery from disasters since the 90s, are that recovery is most difficult for communities with three different characteristics. One is where the damage is most concentrated, where most of the housing units are affected, where the damage is severe, where the housing units have a lot of severe damage, and where there is inadequate or little insurance coverage. Those three things combined make recovery very difficult, and those are also the places where CDBG funds are most important for targeting funds to. So in this analysis, we're looking at where are the communities that have the highest concentration of damage and the most severe of that damage. Another example of the work we've done on that in terms of depth of flooding and the concentration of damage. The other thing you can do with these data, which is also very helpful, is to link the individual assistance data that's aggregated to a geography that you have other data on. So census data, the American Community Survey has data on percent people in poverty, type of housing unit. So we did that kind of linking to try to get a sense of which communities are likely to have some difficulty recovering because of low incomes, because of the types of population, maybe elderly, and also to get at one of these important questions that's come up in this disaster: which communities are predominantly seasonal residences, since that is not an eligible use for these funds. So we did that analysis as well. Hopefully many of you have seen that. If not, we can share that with you. So I am Todd Richardson, and this is Ben Winter, and we're available the next couple of days for folks who want to sit down and talk to us. I don't know if we have time for more questions. Do we have time for a few questions? Okay, so we'll do a few questions. Hopefully we can help that, but we'll be around all day today and tomorrow. Any questions? Cindy?
If there's no disasters in 2013, being the optimist that I am, will those funds become available for the 2012 and 11 disasters?
Yes.
Excellent.
Unless Congress says otherwise, these funds are only available for 11, 12, and 13. Other questions? The Sandy or not? The 11 and the Sandy. So I don't have a firm date on that yet. There's a couple of things that we're trying to get a better handle on. One is the infrastructure numbers, and the other is the Sandy task force is. I know many of you are involved with their work, and so we like to make sure that when the next allocation is in concert with the work they're doing. Make sure that we have the right timing on that. Well, the task force is 180 days, so it'll be within that window. Other questions? So I'm not the expert on expenditure timelines, but I will say some things, and Tennille can correct me. So the expenditure deadlines from time of obligation. So it's not from time of announcing the allocation, it's the time that you've obligated the funds. The expenditure deadline is 2 years from there, and we have 5 years to obligate the money. So I think everyone needs to be cognizant of these 2 points in time as they think about how they proceed with their planning. Sorry, I'm sorry. The requirement is, anybody here wants to speak to this who knows more than I do, but what? Come here. I'm going to stick to the data.
Our team is walking around with microphones so that everyone can hear your question, so I'll exemplify how using the microphone is helpful to the group. I believe the question was, for the subsequent allocations, what's the timeline expenditure that goes with that? When the department announces the second Sandy allocation or the 2011-2012 allocation, those each have their own 2-year time frames. So let's just say that happened next month. In the month of April, that was the announcement for the 2011-2012s. And let's say that was done on, with all the action plans and hyper speed up the process, we sign a grant agreement with you all April 30th. Well, then you would have 2 years from that date to expend the funds associated with that pot of money. When the Sandy money, the second tranche, comes in, we've been calling it tranche. I know it's not technically, but that's what we do. When the second pot of Sandy money is awarded, once we obligate in a grant agreement for that, that will have 2 years on that clock. The clocks do not link with each other, so each pot has its own 2-year clock. Correct. 2 years from the date that you sign a grant agreement with HUD. So when your action plan is approved, we go through the process of reviewing, we've accepted your action plan, we're going to issue a grant agreement to you. The date that that action plan is approved, or excuse me, that date that the grant agreement is executed, that's when your 2-year clock starts. Each pot of money has its own grant agreement. We have said executed. Our funds control plan is under review right now, where we're looking at what our options are on that point. But the question was, is it who signs first that triggers the date? Is it the date HUD signs it? Is it the date the grantee signs it? We've talked to our CFO folks to see if there's any flexibility there, but it will be one of the two will be the trigger. Either the date that HUD signs the grant agreement or the date that the grantee signs it will begin the 2-year clock.
I have a good question or not, Neil. We had been actually discussing this a little bit in North Dakota because we are certainly hopeful that we're going to get an allocation in this next round. And there had been discussion that you could craft your action plan to a certain way that all the funds aren't necessarily obligated immediately, so depending on how much you've got, that the pressure isn't necessarily there that you have to get it all spent in 2 years, but you'd certainly have to get it all obligated within that 2-year period. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
So are you saying partial action plans, or?
Well, that is I don't know that I would say partial action plans, but yes, a partial action plan where you haven't identified everything that you're going to use that funds for, so that your grant doesn't come out so that the whole amount is obligated and that you have to get it spent in that 2-year period. I'm
stalling while Tennille consults.
I might as well just hold the mic. In fact, why don't I go with Ben so that you can?
I think I've been usurped.
Sorry, Ben. You all are missing out on Ben and Todd's good, or I should say Todd and Ben's good knowledge here. So let me just cue up one thing. One, we are covering the action plan session this afternoon, so some of the questions you should probably save until that point. To this question of obligating funds and what's in your action plan. When you submit your action plan to HUD, the expectation is that you are describing how you will use the allocation you receive to address needs from the disasters for which you awarded those funds. For some of you, you have a clear idea of how you're going to use 100% of those funds right now. And so the amount that you are describing and that you're expecting to sign a grant agreement for is for 100% of the allocation. For some of you, you don't have the data, or that you're still trying to figure out how you will meet some of those needs. And while your action plan describes what the needs are, you have not yet identified how you will use your allocation to meet those needs. If that is the case, what you are then submitting to HUD is an action plan that describes a portion of the funds, and that is what your grant agreement will reflect, a portion of the funds. You will not be allowed to access the other funds until you come in with a description of what you'll be using those funds for, what needs it will be addressing, what activities and programs at that level. And so I believe that gets to your question, Cindy, of what's in the action plan and which amounts. I can tell you in conversations with several of you and those who are beneficiaries or would be beneficiaries, I know you're under some pressure to come in with a full and complete action plan for 100% in the amount, and there's actually some political pressure for you to do to not come in any less than that. You feel quite a bit of pressure if you're not outlining all of your resources. So we certainly understand as a department what the challenge is, but the expectation is you will describe in one or more action plans what exactly you're doing, and that your action plans fully reflect your needs, even if you don't have all of your resources allocated at that submission. I will say before we go to the next question, and we're doing pretty good on time, if it is an action plan question, I would prefer that you hold those until the action plan session. Some of those will likely be covered in that. But do you have any remaining questions concerning data and how it's used? That's where Todd and Ben can be especially helpful.
I do have a data question. Anne-Marie Ubing from the CPD office in Newark. And one question related to the Sandy data, how, I know you're getting updates from FEMA, so how often are you updating your analysis? And two, for entitlement grantees who are not disaster recovery grantees, how do they access that data if they're trying to use it for their own entitlement allocations and or to support the state's action plan?
So there are two sets of data that are useful. There's the individual assistance data, and then there's the small business administration data. And FEMA has, as part of the routine use for how the data can be acquired, is to make application to the FEMA staff at the Joint Field Office, actually to the Disaster Recovery Coordinator, for a routine use agreement, and you say, these are the data I would like, and then they process it, and then they send the data. How many of you have actually gone through this process? Like, you're kind of nervous about raising your hands. Does that mean it's not a very fun process? So I know some of you have gone through this process. I know it's been very difficult. We had a meeting with FEMA last week where we talked to them about how we can make this process go a little bit smoother, and they're working on that. But as it currently stands, the current process is what I just described to get the data. For how we get the data updated generally when we need to do allocations. That's the reason we get it. So our data currently is fresh as of January 17th. It's not. It will change over time as more folks come in and get assistance. But we can send you, for example, if you're a state and you want to get an aggregate file of our block group data so that forms this map, we can certainly send that to you. Or if you're a local grantee and you want that block group data, we'll be sharing that with you. In fact, I think Mark's putting together a file to share that with folks already. And we can share with you the aggregates up to the local government level. To get the individual data, you have to go through this routine use approach. Ben?
I want to say... Is this on? Yeah. So I think the date of data that you have is like, the report that you have, I think, is January 2nd or something. We just did a new analysis. We're updating it with January 17th data. It's a couple months ago. But we did learn something from last week from FEMA, that how they're actually kind of doing this triage process with their inspections, so that they're using flyover data to kind of inform to them the prioritization of inspections, so that they're inspecting the most severe cases. So to the extent that we have, just a few inspections left over that are kind of trickling in, and a few of the registrants, additional ones that it's not captured, we kind of think that it's capturing the, pretty full extent of the severe damage.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. Microphone.
Oh, that. I mean.
Thank you. To the extent that the disasters may have impacted the Native American areas, to what extent might that data be included in the FEMA data or data that you used for the allocations?
It is included, and but we looked specifically at the tribal areas, and the tribal areas that we have sort of defined boundaries for, our numbers weren't very large, but we can share that with you. Other questions? Yes, sir. Oh, microphone.
Do you have the elevations of the floodwaters from Hurricane Sandy available that we can access?
So you mean the mapping, sort of to show what the flood depths were?
Yes, the water levels.
The water levels. That is available. We used it for some of our mapping earlier. I can talk to our GIS folks and see if they can make that available. Other questions? I have a question. Todd, is there research on prior disasters that might be helpful to grantees? Well, thank you for asking that question, because it turns out there's a little bit of research. At huduser.org, which is the website for the Policy Development and Research Office, it has that nice mapping thing there, but it also has some research you might want to look at. One of them is we completed a study that looked at the recovery from Katrina and Rita in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And it talks about their programs, and it talks about how people manage to recover under those programs, tracking recovery over time. And I think it's a helpful thing to look at if you're setting up a program of your own, to get a sense of how long it takes, the challenges you run into. We also have worked with FEMA. For any of you who are thinking about doing alternative housing kind of options, we did an evaluation of FEMA's alternative housing pilot program. Some of that data is out there. We are going to have a study shortly on the Katrina DHEP program, for anybody who ultimately is interested in that. So we have a few other studies there. Any other questions?
Get the mic.
I just want to add to the question about flood inundation. In addition to data on that, one of the things that the federal government's been trying to do, and NOAA and the Council for Environmental Quality and others in the federal government have been leading this effort to give access to data on sea level rise and projected storm inundation over time with sea level rise. So if you're thinking about mitigation, which we'd encourage you all to think about mitigation against future disasters, and that you believe that data may be helpful to you, we can make that available to you as well.
Tennille had a question. Would you like to repeat it, or I can state it? She was just asking, is there other kind of local data sets that you might have somewhere in your city departments or zoning departments that might be of use in doing your action plans?
Others here might be able to speak better to this, but what I've seen people use in the past, which seem to be pretty effective, is information from your building inspecting departments, especially inspections to determine whether folks need to meet, in relation to the flood insurance program, whether the house is 50% damaged or not. That seems to be a useful piece of data. From your state insurance agencies, usually there's some useful information from the insurance, from the insurance companies.
And also your parcel level data can be a very rich resource, especially if you can match it onto the FEMA IA data, if you are able to get that from FEMA.
Anyone else have suggestions? www.huduser.org. Ben, you ask hard questions. Any more hard questions for me? No? All right, thanks.